Okay. So for today's presentation, our speaker is Alison Schulenburg. She is a student at the University of Maryland, College Park in the Department of Plant Science and Landscape Architecture. She's going to be talking today about management options for farmers facing saltwater intrusion on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay.
Okay, I'll start sharing my screen. All right, can everybody see that?
You're good.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. As Megan said, I will be talking about management options for farmers facing saltwater intrusion on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay. So, rising sea levels, storms, and king tides push saltwater intrusion into coastal agricultural fields, and this phenomenon is known as saltwater intrusion, and that alters nutrient cycling and damages crop yields. So researchers and farmers alike are looking for solutions to adapt to and mitigate the effects of saltwater intrusion. Specifically, at the University of Maryland, I work in the Tully lab, and we have a current project to understand the survival of different crops and plant treatments under these saltwater intruding conditions and the potential for these plants to survive and remove excess nutrients, for example, sodium from the soil. And the results from this study will help inform new management practices to increase soil health and also maintain crop yields. And the overall goal of this work is to guide local best management practices so we can have some potential easement opportunities for landowners that are facing the saltwater intrusion. Today, I'll provide you with the background information on saltwater intrusion, how the soil and plants respond to saltwater intrusion, whether that be soil dispersion or sodium toxicity in plants, and potentially introduce possible new strategies to adapt to or mitigate the effects of saltwater intrusion. That's through the planting of salt-tolerant crops or maybe transitioning fields to marshes. So what is saltwater intrusion? Saltwater intrusion is the movement of sea salts into freshwater aquifers and shallow groundwater tables. And as sea levels continue to rise, saltwater intrusion will only worsen with devastating consequences to agroecosystems along the coast of the Chesapeake Bay. Saltwater intrusion in our region is generally facilitated by extensive ditch networks or tidal channels, which is able to connect the coastal agricultural lands to saline water bodies. So the image on the left is actually one of our field sites in Cambridge, Maryland, that is experiencing standing water during high tide. And then the photo on the right is drowning corn on a farm in Princess Anne, Maryland. Many farmers have watched their crops drown in saltwater after a large storm or even just during high tide. And so I hope to provide you with background on the causes and effects of saltwater intrusion and what potential new strategies to consider if you're actually experiencing this on your field. So there are many causes of saltwater intrusion, the first being sea level rise. There's also storms and tides, or the frequency and intensity that is able to push saltwater further inland. We also have drought. More frequent droughts that last longer can lead to saltwater incursion. Water management and connectivity through those tidal channels and ditch networks that connect the saltwater to the agricultural fields. All of these causes lead to the salinization of agricultural fields, which changes soil biogeochemistry. And so some of these effects of increased salt concentrations on the land are coastal forest loss, or the formation of ghost forests, species invasion, or the formation or the ability of more salt-tolerant invasive species to encroach on the land and degrade habitat quality. We also have yield declines, eutrophication, which causes algal blooms, fish death, and overall decreased biodiversity. And finally, marsh migration, which forces tidal marshes into uplands. And I want to focus your attention to one cause and a few effects. So I want to start with sea level rise. Globally, sea levels are rising. This graph is a global average sea level change since 1880. And the different colors in the lines indicates the improvements in all the technologies that we use to measure sea level rise. So we can see that sea levels are steadily increasing over the last 140 years. And in only 20 years, we increased from 6 inches to almost 10 inches of sea level rise. And this is just linearly increasing. Until recently, there's been very little research on the impact of saltwater intrusion on coastal farmland, even though we know that a lot of the area is prone to shallow coastal flooding, which is indicated by the red shaded area here. My research actually focuses on the Chesapeake Bay because sea levels are rising at twice the global average rate, so 3.2 millimeters compared to 1.7 millimeters of sea level rise per year. And the Chesapeake Bay estuary is unique in that its waters range from fresh to saline, so anywhere from 0 to 30 parts per thousand. And these low-lying coastal regions along the eastern shore are very vulnerable to high tide flooding and sea level rise. And then homes and farms in Dorchester and Somerset counties have a mean elevation of about 2.7 meters above sea level, and those areas are severely threatened by sea level rise, because this region is actually predicted to experience sea level rise of 0.8 to 1.6 feet, or about half of a meter by 2050. So these are the areas that I'm focusing on. So I'm just going to zoom in. And the first arrow on top is indicating the Dorchester County area, and then the lower arrow is the Somerset County area. And as you can see, it's very prominently red where this high tide flooding is. So saltwater intrusion is often invisible, moving silently underground into water tables or through ditches that drain fields. However, nuisance flooding is the temporary inundation of low-lying areas during the high tide events. These floods are a more visible form of saltwater intrusion, as you can see from this image in Princess Anne, Maryland. Landowners and farmers on the eastern shore are all too familiar with sunny day flooding, all the while saltwater intrusion is happening in the background. Unfortunately, nuisance flooding is occurring more frequently. Over the last several decades, annual frequencies of high tide flooding are increasing. The more red indicates the more sunny day flooding. So this image features areas around the Chesapeake Bay. The first image is in 2019. Some locations in the Chesapeake Bay had 10 nuisance flooding days based on the lunar cycle and offshore wind, storm, and ocean circulation patterns. The next image is in a prediction of what will happen in 2030, and the frequency of sunny day flooding is likely to increase. So it'll increase to about 15 to 40 flood days that are expected. And then only 20 years later, in 2050, they are predicted to double to once every 3 to 6 days. So 60 to 120 flood days. Looking at one specific location, Solomon's Island experienced 2 flood days in 2020. Only 1 year later, in 2021, they actually were predicted to have 5 to 8 flood days. So by 2030, they can expect 10 to 20 flood days. And then 20 years later, they're projected to more than double to actually 45 to 165 flood days, which is extremely frequent. So now that we have focused on one of the causes of saltwater intrusion, sea level rise, I now want to focus on one major effect, and that will be coastal forest loss. Saltwater intrusion causes the formation of ghost forests, as I mentioned before, which you may be used to seeing as you drive down the necks of the peninsula. Osmotic stress for vascular plants increases tree mortality, and over time, this eventually leads to the conversion from forested wetlands to brackish marshes. So this figure is from a recent study by Karen Gadan and Matt Kerwin. The large green bars indicate the rate for forest retreat, and the formation of these ghost forests has only increased over the past century. There was at least a 1 meter increase in forest retreat per year, and you can see a dramatic increase in the retreat rate in the Long Shoal River, North Carolina area from less than 1 meter lost per year to nearly 5 meters lost per year. This also affects coastal farmland. Dorchester and Somerset counties are located along the coast of the Chesapeake Bay, and recent work suggests that as much as 30% of the land area in these counties are at risk for saltwater intrusion. In fact, this area is already experiencing the impacts of saltwater intrusion, as roughly 2% of the agricultural land has actually transitioned into marshland over the past 8 years. So from 2009 to 2017. Now that we focused on coastal forest loss, I want to focus your attention to one other major effect, which is crop yield declines, which I feel like affects a lot of you here today. And I want to discuss some potential solutions and other options for landowners and farmers that are experiencing these yield declines. So first, we need to know, how does saltwater intrusion affect coastal soils and crops, leading to a decrease in land productivity and yield? So this image is of one of our field sites in Crisfield, Maryland. There's a tidal channel very close nearby that has a salinity of about 18 parts per thousand. So as saltwater intrusion advances across the landscape, it alters concentrations of sodium as it comes onto the field. The saline water from the tidal channel contains sodium ions that will travel onto the field, which causes detrimental effects to both the soil and the crop. Saltwater is comprised of 96% water and 4% of dissolved salt. 30.4% of those salts are actually consisting of sodium, and the other ions that contribute to salinity levels that cause problems in soils and plants are chlorine, sulfate, magnesium, calcium, and potassium. But I'm going to focus on sodium and how that affects the soil and plants. So you may have seen this table before. It is from Dr. Jared Miller over at the University of Delaware. And this is just salt concentrations and soil tests. So saline soils have a sodium absorption ratio of less than 13, an exchangeable sodium percentage less than 15, an electrical conductivity greater than 4 millisiemens per centimeter, and a soil pH of less than 8.5. So when you transition to these sodic soils, they have a sodium absorption ratio greater than 13, an exchangeable sodium percentage greater than 15, and electrical conductivity less than 4 millisiemens per centimeter, and a soil pH greater than 8.5. So this is the exact opposite of those saline soils. And then the saline sodic soils have the sodium absorption ratio greater than 13, exchangeable sodium percentage greater than 15, an electrical conductivity greater than 4 millisiemens per centimeter, and a soil pH less than 8.5. So I'm showing you this table just because I'm going to be showing different sodium concentrations that are found in the soils from our field sites. And these sodium concentrations range from 44 to 1,000 milligrams per kilogram. So no pH is greater than 8.5. SARs that are greater than 13 is in areas where nothing grows. ESP greater than 15 is found in dead areas. And like I said, the sodium concentration ranges from 44 to 1,000 milligrams per kilogram. So this is showing you some data from a farm in Maryland. It shows that increasing saltwater intrusion also increases sodium concentrations in the soil. So we start at a field in Salisbury, Maryland, which is about 0 to 4 parts per thousand of concentration of sodium in the soil. And then when you move to the center of a salty field, you can experience a range of 4 to 8 parts per thousand. And when you get more towards the ditch bank soils, that's 8 to 12 parts per thousand. So if we're saying that increasing saltwater intrusion on farm fields increases sodium concentrations in the soil, a non-salinized soil will have about 10 to 50 milligrams per kilogram of sodium. A salinized field will have 100 to 300 milligrams per kilogram of sodium. And finally, the extremely salinized soil will have 600 to 1,200 milligrams per kilogram of sodium. So saline soils can generally be found in arid regions, estuaries, and coastal fringes, which are dominated by sodium ions with electrical conductivity more than 4 millisiemens per centimeter. and that corresponds to approximately 40 millimolar NaCl concentrations and an ESP of lower than 15 with a low pH. So as saltwater intrusion advances, these sea salts move into the groundwater that eventually will rise to the field surface. So both soils and plants are affected by this. Soil experiences salt crusts that are not suitable for crops, and this evaporation that occurs from it being more dry drives the transport of these salt solutions into the soil surface. And then as water evaporates, these ions remain near the free surface. Eventually, the salt precipitates on top of the soil specimen, blocking plant roots from getting the water that they need, which causes vegetation to experience dieback due to these high salt concentrations, and that also stunts plant growth. So moving on to some more about the salinity levels, high concentrations of sodium in the soils can lead to swelling and soil dispersion, reducing drainage and infiltration in the soil. And then that increase in dissolved salt concentrations impedes the movement of water and nutrients across root membranes in plants. And finally, high salinity levels can cause a decrease in plant growth and overall lower yields of crops. This image is a photo of a lysimeter, which actually takes up groundwater by a pressure mechanism. And so we can collect these water samples and actually measure concentrations that are found in the groundwater. So I'll now briefly explain soil colloids in order to better understand how sodium affects the soil, specifically through soil dispersion. So soil colloids are 45% mineral and 5% organic matter surrounded by pore space, which is filled with both air and water. And this is likely to be equal concentrations, but it varies between 20 to 30%. So soil colloids are the finer size fractions of the soil, for example, clay and organic matter that are less than 0.001 millimeters in size. They are the most active constituent of the soil, and they determine the physical and chemical properties of the soil. They are important because their surfaces attract soil nutrients that are dissolved in the soil, for example, nitrogen, water as positively charged mineral ions, or cations like calcium and magnesium. And the ion that I'm tracking is sodium because of its role in soil dispersion. So here I'm showing two examples of compacted soil due to sodium. Soil compaction changes the pore size space, distribution, and soil strength. So this causes the cracks that you can see here indicated by the red arrows. Soil dispersion and compaction actually causes a decrease in infiltration and percolation rates, and that ultimately decreases plant productivity. So dispersion can also cause more ponding and issues with root penetration, as you can see in the figure on the right. In order to understand how soil dispersion occurs, I will explain cations. So cations are positively charged ions made up of more protons than electrons. As you can see, a sodium atom is made up of 9 protons and 9 electrons, giving it a neutral charge. But when sodium gives away one of its electrons, it becomes positive, making sodium a cation. Soils are negative, and they're actually surrounded by positive cations. So soils contain a layer of cations, and that's what causes them to disperse. In our system, soils disperse through exchanging of sodium with calcium and magnesium cations. So I'm going to go through a 4-step process. Sodium is able to change the soil structure through the cation exchange process. In this process, the plant's roots absorb many of the nutrients that are needed for growth, and it absorbs about 70% of the cations through this cation exchange process. So if there's an imbalance in the cations on the colloids, it'll prevent the plant from being able to take up its proper balance of essential nutrients. So this trading can occur between cations and the soil solution. And in this case, we're going to be talking about sodium from salt water and the cations that are already present on the colloid. So I'm going to focus on calcium and magnesium, like I said before, because sodium is actually able to efficiently exchange with these cations due to its charge and size. So because calcium is actually +2 charged, you need twice as many sodium ions to counter those negative charges on the clay surface. So the first step is that calcium and magnesium are replaced by sodium on the soil colloid, and twice as many of those sodium ions are needed to replace that due to its charge. Here you will see how this exchange occurs on the soil colloid. That's the brown, interesting shape that I have included here. The topsoil is under normal conditions, and then we show what happens when there's high sodium concentrations underneath. Soil colloids are negatively charged and have those cations that'll stick to the surface when the charge is balanced. So you can see there are 2 negative charges, and calcium +2 is attached to that area. But when calcium and magnesium are on the surface and are exchanged with sodium, as you can see in this bottom figure, you need 2 sodium ions in order to replace that calcium on the soil. So the third step is that the sodium ions will create a thicker layer on the outside of the colloid. So these forces of cohesion cannot attract the surfaces to one another, so they're more likely to repel. And this will create unstable microaggregates that facilitate soil compaction. So sodium-induced clay dispersion is able to reduce that aggregate stability that we're looking for to have healthy productivity. So these forces of cohesion cannot attract the colloid surfaces to one another. Charges are so large. So soil dispersion and compaction cause a decrease in infiltration and percolation rates, and ultimately a decrease in plant productivity. So this dispersion causes more ponding and issues with root penetration. Therefore, soil sodium needs to be drawn down in order to increase soil health. Some plants are able to do this, while others are not so fortunate under these high salt conditions. So here I'm showing you a chart of known salinity levels and their respective concentrations of sodium. Soil salinity levels ranging from 5 to 20 parts per thousand have been observed in farm soils across the lower eastern shore of Maryland, also due to saltwater intrusion. So most of these agronomic crops in the region cannot tolerate salinity levels above 1 to 3 parts per thousand. So anything higher than this red line is actually toxic to most plants. So now we'll talk about how these sodium concentrations will affect plants. Globally, sodium toxicity threatens 25 to 33% of all agricultural land, which contributes to $12 to $27.3 billion in annual economic loss, based mainly on reduced crop yields. In arid regions, sodium is introduced to the system when crops are irrigated with water pumped from mineral-rich aquifers. However, sodium is also a main constituent of seawater and can be introduced by saltwater intrusion in these coastal low-lying areas. As fields salinize, the increase in dissolved salt concentrations can impede the movement of water and nutrients across root membranes in plants, which hinders their ability to remove sodium from the soil. So the presence of these high levels of sodium decreases plant growth by causing cation deficiency, which I'll explain next. And finally, some plants are able to better include or exclude this excess sodium, and they have respective ion and osmotic stress pathways that they can employ once they figure out where these increased salt concentrations come from. So by reducing the amount of sodium in the soil through plant uptake, there will be a decrease in soil dispersion, which increases infiltration and percolation rates, and hopefully will increase plant productivity. So now I will talk about cation deficiency. When there's an increase in sodium concentrations in the soil, this causes an excess influx of sodium into the plant root cells. Because of the balance of the types of cations in the cell is changed, this results in cation deficiency. This is able to inhibit photosynthesis, and it causes accelerated leaf aging. So this image of corn on the right is experiencing cation deficiency, as you can see in the browning of the leaves. Symptoms of plants experiencing cation deficiency, specifically potassium, are yellowing at the tips, at the edge of some younger leaves, and then it starts to develop on these older leaves. And these plants can undergo ion homeostasis and increase the amount of sodium that they are able to excrete or exclude based on the amount of cations that are in the leaf. So here are some more examples of sodium toxicity in plants. The image on the left shows leaf tip necrosis or scorching of the leaf tip, and that's shown where the brown is. And then on the right, you see stunted growth and wilting, where too much sodium has caused many plants to stop growing or die. So how does this happen? Increased concentrations of salt from seawater causes osmotic stress. The image on the right shows salty soil that has stunted the growth of these plants. Osmotic stress inhibits water transport, photosynthesis, and ultimately plant growth. Some of these plants can trigger osmotic adjustment and accumulate solutes to change the osmotic pressure to allow water to enter the roots. So I'll show that mechanism next. So this is a figure of non-saline soil. And as salt increases, soil osmotic pressure, it also increases, and then it'll interfere with plant nutrition. So high salt concentrations in the soil solution actually will decrease the ability of plants to take up water. So this is referred to as the osmotic potential of soil water, which makes it more difficult for the roots to remove water from the soil. As you can see, the arrow pointing up has become smaller, which makes it more difficult to get water and nutrients to the rest of the plant. So this lost energy used to make osmotic adjustment results in reduced growth. And one way to minimize this is by planting salt-tolerant crops. So here is a table of 4 common crops: corn, wheat, sorghum, and barley. Crops have a salinity threshold with any value higher will result in reduced growth or yield. And I converted the salinity threshold to an electrical conductivity threshold, and I calculated the salt level of salinity. So as you can see, corn has a very low threshold of 0.9, and wheat, sorghum, and barley can tolerate those higher salinity levels. And anything higher than 3 parts per thousand is expected to show promise on the saltwater intrusion fields, because the agronomic crops usually can't survive higher than 3 parts per thousand, but wheat, sorghum, and barley actually are able to survive higher than 3. So a former master's student, Elizabeth De La Guerra, published a paper in 2020 on the effects of saltwater intrusion and on germination success of standard and alternative crops. The x-axis is increasing salinity, and the y-axis is percent germination. The red dots represent the salt stress treatment, and the blue triangles represent the osmotic stress treatment. She showed that germination rates in wheat and barley actually showed promise in tests of osmotic stress in the lab. The germination rates were much higher than that of corn. So with sodium and salt concentrations increasing in agricultural soils with saltwater intrusion that causes soil dispersion and osmotic stress in plants, what can we do to adapt? In my master's research, I will be measuring nutrient concentrations in 5 different species leaf tissue and also in the soil below the treatment. I've separated them by management practice. So the first is sorghum and soybean, and they are a part of the adaptation approach because they tolerate higher salinity levels. Switchgrass is the representative remediation species because it's able to tolerate water and nutrient limitations and has the ability to produce moderate to high biomass yields on marginal lands. The restoration species is a native marsh species, Spartina patens, that tolerates much higher salinity levels. And finally, if farmers do not wish to put any more into their land and they've exhausted all their options, I will look at native switchgrass to represent the weeds in the abandonment approach. As stated before, most agronomic crops in the region do not tolerate salinity levels above 1 to 3 parts per thousand. So these elevated salinity levels have forced farmers to reconsider their management practices. One of the options is to adapt to increasing salinity levels by farming with salt-tolerant crops. Salt-tolerant crops are able to maintain productivity when salt levels are higher than 3 parts per thousand, even with the potential for the losses under saltwater intrusion conditions. Many landowners desire to persevere and continue farming. So the adaptation response includes planting salt-tolerant crops such as salt-tolerant soybean and sorghum. These crops are more adapted to those high salt conditions, more than traditional corn, soybean, wheat rotations. So I included a chart here where I converted the salinity threshold to an electrical conductivity threshold and the salt level of the salinity on the chart. And you can see that the chloride excluding soybean, switchgrass, and quinoa thresholds are much higher than that of corn, wheat, and barley, which, as a reminder, they had thresholds of 0.9, 3.3, and 4.4 parts per thousand, respectively. From Elizabeth's publication mentioned earlier on the effects of saltwater intrusion on germination success of standard and alternative crops, she showed that germination rates in chloride excluding soy and quinoa showed promise in tests of osmotic stress in the lab. As you can see, the percent germination rate was higher. So with this data, we were able to conclude that it would be a waste of time and money to plant or collect corn and wheat on these saltwater intruded fields, unfortunately. We also found that it would be worth it to see how soybean, barley, and sorghum performed, as they had those higher percent germination rates. So the crop species that showed the most promise for maintaining this yield in saline fields are soybeans. They're more salt tolerant than corn, and they're bred for tolerance to irrigation salts. Barley, it has well-known salt tolerance and matures earlier than wheat. And finally, sorghum is drought and salt tolerant, and there is currently a market for it on the Eastern Shore. So I'll now show you some of our field sites on the Eastern Shore of Maryland and their plant performance and crop yields. So the Salty Ditch is located on the right side of the field, and we have replicate blocks of 6 treatments planted on the field, the treatments that I referred to earlier. We collect biomass yields each year, and this data is from 2019. The treatments are the same as mentioned before. So we have our native marsh species, which is Spartina patens, which is SP, switchgrass, which is SW, a crop rotation, which includes soybeans, sorghum, and barley, and then finally the weeds, which is the control. The green indicates good yields, and the red indicates bad yields, or little to no biomass, which are normalized across the field. So closer to the ditch, where the soil may be saltier, causes the problems that I mentioned earlier, making it more difficult for plants to grow. Barley and soybean had a lot of red across the entire field. Spartina had the most green. Overall, barley did horribly, sorghum did okay, and the native marsh grass did good. And it's important to note that these sites are really wet, and barley is fairly salt tolerant, but these sites are wet in the winter, which causes them to do more poorly. At another farm site, we see similar trends. So the Salty Ditch is on the left side, and surprisingly, Spartina patens did not do as good at this site. And then if you look at some more data, it was just from another part of the field, but I wanted to paste it over. More data shows that sorghum actually had the most green. Again, barley did terrible, soybean did okay, and sorghum did pretty good at this field site. So with this data, we can start making informed decisions. One option is to plant alternative crops, such as salt-tolerant soybean or sorghum, or even quinoa. Planting alternative crops will improve markets because they'll likely survive better under saline conditions, and they can also be sold for profit. Another option is to take this remediation approach. This utilizes low input crops that produce large quantities of biomass in order to draw down those soil nutrients like legacy phosphorus or sodium. And it can either be harvested or replanted for a few years before returning to agriculture. So the example I'm showing you here is Panicum virgatum, or switchgrass. It's a fast-growing perennial species. It tolerates both water and nutrient limitations, and it could be used for biofuel or have potential use as poultry bedding. Otherwise, switchgrass can be harvested to remove sodium from the system, which is what we want to kind of increase that soil health and plant productivity. So the saltwater intrusion project focuses on 4 farms that are located on the eastern shore of Maryland. 2 farms are located in Somerset County. One is A, which is Farm 1, and C, which is Farm 3. One is located in Dorchester County, which is B, and then one of them is a no salt control, which is found in Quantico, Maryland, which is D. And this figure is showing how the sites will actually be affected after that 1 foot of sea level rise occurs, which is predicted to happen by 2050. So now I'll show you some preliminary data that I've already collected to show the efficiency of these species that I introduced to you. Preliminary data from our field sites in Somerset County actually suggests that the planting of restoration species, or that Spartina patens, and remediation species, which is the switchgrass, may reduce pore water phosphorus concentrations. And this shows promise for the treatments to remove other nutrients from the pore water and potentially the soil. So focusing on removing that phosphorus and sodium. This is data from baseline soil that we took from our 4 field sites and our no salt control. This figure is actually a depth profile of soil phosphorus, and the axis is flipped. So the top of the y-axis is the soil surface, and the x-axis is the concentration of soil phosphorus as we move down the profile. Baseline soil total phosphorus concentrations decrease with depth, and then both A and C, which were found in Somerset County, actually have higher phosphorus concentrations than in Dorchester County and the no salt control, especially in those shallower depths, so from 0 to 20 centimeters. And then the error bars represent the standard error of the mean. And it showed that there, between each site, the concentrations of phosphorus were significantly different. So I also conducted a pilot study on soils collected a year after the baseline soil. And this is Malic 3 available phosphorus instead of total. And I looked at 2 separate treatments. This is indicating the salt marsh hay, or the Spartina patens. The x-axis is Malic 3 available phosphorus concentration, and then the y-axis is that decreasing depth that you saw earlier. So A and C have the highest concentrations of available soil phosphorus under the salt marsh hay treatment, which makes sense because those 2 sites did have high initial concentrations of total phosphorus compared to site B. And there appears to be no strong effect of section. So where the plot was located on the field, if it was closer to the ditch, was section 1, so you'd expect there to be saltier soil there. And then section 3 is more towards the middle of the field where it's less salty. This is a similar figure, but instead of it being salt marsh hay, it's actually switchgrass. So the x-axis is the same, it's Malic 3 available phosphorus, and then the y-axis is decreasing depth. And again, sites A and C have those higher concentrations of available soil phosphorus compared to B. And there also appears to be no significant effect of where the plants were located on the field, how much phosphorus they were able to have. This data is looking at the first year that we planted our alternative treatments, so salt marsh hay, switchgrass, and weeds. The before data was about the soil, but this is actually taking direct leaf tissue measurements. So on the x-axis, you have section in meters, so how close it was located to the ditch or how far away it was. So 0 to 5 meters is closest to the ditch, and then 15 to 20 meters is furthest away. So as you can see, the weeds actually had the highest concentrations of phosphorus, followed by switchgrass, and then finally salt marsh hay. And those error bars still represent the standard error of the mean, and differences in treatments were tested and were significantly different at both sites. So that was very surprising to see that the weeds actually had higher phosphorus concentrations in their leaf tissue. I also looked at crop grains. So I looked at sorghum and soybean grains that we took off of those same field sites, and I measured the concentration of phosphorus within the grains. Similarly, the x-axis is in section, so how close it was to the tidal channel or how far away it was. And we noticed that soybean phosphorus concentrations were actually slightly higher than sorghum across the fields at both sites, despite farm 2 actually had less soil total phosphorus, as you remember from before, and site C actually had higher, but they were still about the same, and they were significantly different. So another option besides doing the remediation was to plant restoration species. So if you plant salt marsh hay, it's actually able to facilitate the transition to marshland that could be beneficial as a last line of defense to protect coastlines from flooding and loss of nutrients. Most plants are able to make ionic and osmotic adjustments to an increase in sodium concentrations, but these plants actually have the ability to uptake higher levels of sodium and remove it from the soil, decreasing soil dispersion and then increasing overall plant productivity. So in the chart, you can see its salinity threshold is 63 parts per thousand, which is very high. Finally, we want to support marshes. So restoring farm fields involves planting those native marsh species, which encourages the return of water flow, which creates a wildlife habitat that supports recreational activities like waterfowl hunting. There are also state and federal level conservation programs that can support restoration practices like EQIP or the Coastal Resiliency Plans in Maryland. And marshes are also good buffers for nutrient loss and can protect upland areas from storm surge. So if you're interested in enrolling in Maryland state programs, you can get more info from your Soil Conservation District office. So restoring these wetlands actually has positive benefits for the ecosystem while still helping landowners maintain their livelihood. These programs are mostly at the federal level through EQIP, and with this option being explored more, we hope that this facilitates more easement programs to help support more landowners. So you may be wondering if there are other options that you maybe want to explore if planting restoration or remediation species may not be for you. There are some short-term solutions that may allow farmers to continue farming as usual, but it is important to note that all of these options are actually very expensive. Tide gates protect fields from tidal flooding, and when tide waters are low, water behind the dike can drain out. Unfortunately, this approach concentrates salt. Another con of this is that if not everybody is doing it, it will actually be unsuccessful. The next option is to clean ditches with the use of a backhoe. This allows the field to be reconnected to salt water, which might cause more harm than good long term. And finally, you can elevate your field by building up the soil to combat those low elevation areas from experiencing flooding. But this may cause more compaction of the soil, and sea level rise and saltwater intrusion will eventually catch up. So in addition to this, you'll be adding more nutrients to the soil that may run off into the bay with increasing precipitation and those nuisance flooding or high tide floods. Abandoning fields can lead to the production of vigorous ag weeds. Also, when drainage is no longer managed, species are able to invade, and the invasion is mostly of Phragmites, which is very, very difficult to control. Phragmites actually occupies areas with salinity levels greater than 18 parts per thousand because Phragmites is limited by salinity, which under most circumstances prevents it from further expanding. Disturbance creates an opportunity for the colonization of vacant areas by Phragmites, which is better adapted to the resulting brackish conditions. And this may also alter deer pressure on existing land. And as marshes migrate in, you may observe more deer on your fields because they have really nowhere else to go. So now that I have explained saltwater intrusion, some causes and effects, and what we can do to adapt, I want to make some final conclusions and takeaways from this session. First, saltwater intrusion alters nutrient cycling and damages crop yields through soil dispersion and sodium toxicity. Soil dispersion is due to high concentrations of sodium in the soil that creates unstable microaggregates that reduces infiltration and ultimately reduces plant productivity. Sodium toxicity threatens 25 to 33% of all agricultural land, contributing to annual economic losses based mainly on reduced crop yields. Salt-tolerant crops are more adapted to high salt conditions than traditional corn, soybean, wheat rotations, and can be planted on saltwater intruded fields and survive to allow farmers to maintain productivity. And finally, marshes encourage the return of water flow, creating a wildlife habitat that supports recreational activities like waterfowl hunting and can protect upland areas against storm surge. So this concludes my talk. And with that, thank you so much for listening.
All right, I have my chat box up. So if you want to put any questions or comments in the chat box, you're welcome to, or you can unmute yourself and talk as well. Just a reminder, if there are multiple people watching from the same device, the same account, and everyone needs nutrient management credits, then you need to let me know that. Either you can direct message me in the chat box, you can email me, but I will be getting this information to MDA probably later today or tomorrow.
Should I stop sharing my screen?
It does, it's up to you. Let's see, there's a question. Has there been any work done to test whether salty soils change the nutritional quality of crops harvested from those soils?
So our lab has not done any work on that, and I'm not sure if there are any other labs that are looking at the nutritional quality, but I feel like if there is increased sodium concentrations in the soil, it changes the way that nutrients are allowed to move throughout the plant, or maybe even get uptake by the plant. So it might have an effect. I would say that I would predict it would, yes.
Yeah, we'll give it a minute or so in case anybody is typing. Can you share the maps again of where the salt intrusion is occurring?
Yeah. Okay, all the way back to the beginning. Here. This map?
Yeah, I'm just curious as to, I mean, I know it affects us badly on the Eastern Shore, but I'm wondering, you know, when are we going to see it on the, you know, see these problems on the other side as well?
Yeah, so it's super high. It moves super high up on the field on the right hand side, but then it doesn't encroach as much on the left hand side.
Looks like Delaware, between Delaware and New Jersey, looks like quite a bit there too.
Yeah, definitely in the Delaware Bay.
I guess down here on the lower shore, we're the hot spot for it, at least right now.
Right.
We're the hot spot for everything. All right, there's another question in the chat box. Any non-traditional crops that maybe could be feedstock for renewable fuels or other beneficial uses that may be possible to make the best use of salt intruded soils?
So I feel like non-traditional crops that we like to talk about is quinoa, just because there's not usually always a market for it over here on the Eastern Shore, but it does have an extremely high salinity tolerance, and it would produce a lot of grain that would eventually leave the field. The good thing about crops is that when the nutrients get taken up within these grains, that's actually the part that leaves the field. So we hope that the more phosphorus or sodium, whatever's damaging the fields, quinoa. There you go. we hope that by having these higher concentrations within the grains that actually leave the field itself, it takes those concentrations with it so that there's lower concentrations of phosphorus and sodium in the soil that would eventually damage or either get run off into the bay. Quinoa, I think it could be a grain. A lot of people eat it. I don't know if you can feed it to livestock. I don't know if chickens would eat that. Not quite sure, but it's pretty good for human consumption.
It's probably not cost effective for livestock. Yeah, it looks like some people in the group eat it.
I'm a vegetarian, and I feel like it's a large part of a lot of the meals that I make. It's a good like extra source of like carbs and protein. So
now, you all did not look at miscanthus for this project, did you?
No, we did not. But there's actually another project that my PI Kate Tully is working on. It's I can't remember how to spell out, but it's NSWF. It's NSWF. I'm not sure what organization, but it specifically is looking at restoration species and the movement of like the blackwater duck back onto some of this ag farmland. So restoring wetlands or more of like native marshes.
We have, I know we have a pretty big fields like midshore. I want to think Caroline County maybe, where they are growing miscanthus for bedding for poultry houses. So there is a definite market for miscanthus. All right, Emily posted the fact sheet on miscanthus. So there's a link in there if you're interested in, if anybody's interested in that. And our last in this series is going to be about miscanthus, because we're look at it too for problems with deer. So the salt gets us, and there's no nutritional value in miscanthus. So yeah, the deer tend to leave it alone.
Right. Yeah, actually our fields were a little bit devastated this year. A lot of the farmers that have plots nearby our fields usually will grow corn or soy, and they didn't. And so because there was nothing growing next to our field, deer and birds like came onto our field and ate a lot of our crop grains. So we have less data for that in 2021. And I will be looking at how the effects of saltwater intrusion, how these sodium and phosphorus concentrations have changed over time. So I have soil that I collected from 2021, as well as plant biomass and crop grains that I will be measuring concentrations in to kind of see like how the phosphorus moved throughout the field over time, if it was removed or if it just kept getting replenished, depending on which species were planted there and which species were removed from the field.
All right. If you have any questions, go ahead and type them in the chat box or unmute yourself. Keep it all right.
Okay. Thank you.
We'll keep it open for another minute or so, see if anybody else jumps in, or if you have any feedback on the presentation too. That's always nice to read and hear.
Yeah, especially if you have any comments on like how in depth I get within these mechanisms, if there were still things that you didn't understand, maybe about soil dispersion, how that occurs through the cation exchange process, or if the cation deficiency and sodium toxicity in plants, if that didn't make sense, if there's something that you wish I clarified on, or if it was easy to understand.
And send me comments too on how well you like you don't have to do it on this one, but eventually let me know what you liked, what you didn't like about the series in general. So we can decide what to do moving forward with it. I do like being able to bring in speakers from all over, with them having to lose an entire day traveling down here. I think it is helpful for them and for you all as well. And I have colleagues across the state too, so I can put them all to work. I like putting the students to work too. You know, it's a unique opportunity to be able to grab students from campus, because I do remember these being with our advisory councils for extension. That was one of the requests several years ago, was they wanted to know what type of research was being done on campus. So this is one way that we can have direct access to that, is to, you know, have the students who are working on it present it, or have the professors present it if they're available. And then you get to know exactly what's going on. And we'll have Ronnie Haymaker's son next week. I wonder if he will tune in for that one.